Story number 1.
The Forgotten Orphanage. Every town has a place that feels off. A building the locals avoid. A spot where stories linger like shadows. For the small town of Briar Glen, that place was the Blackwood Orphanage. Abandoned for decades, the orphanage sat at the edge of town, its windows shattered, ivy climbing its crumbling walls. Most people didn't talk about it, but when they did, the stories were always the same. Children disappearing, ghostly laughter at night, and shadows that moved where no one stood. When Emma moved to Briar Glen, she thought the stories were nothing more than local folklore. She was a journalist, after all, and skeptics didn't scare easily. So when her editor suggested a Halloween feature on the orphanage, Emma jumped at the chance. "Maybe you'll finally be the one to solve the mystery," her editor joked, handing her the keys to the padlock that had been placed on the orphanage gates decades ago. Emma smiled, but deep down she felt a flicker of unease. The orphanage loomed over her as she arrived, its silhouette stark against the gray autumn sky. Emma parked her car and approached the gates. The rusty padlock clicked open with a satisfying snap, and she pushed the gates wide. The air was colder here, as if the building itself exhaled frost. Camera in hand, Emma stepped inside. The foyer was dark, the only light coming from the holes in the roof. Dust hung in the air and the floor creaked under her boots. She called out, more out of habit than expectation. "Hello? Anyone here?" Her voice echoed, but there was no reply. The first few rooms were empty. Desks overturned, papers scattered, and graffiti covering the walls. Emma took photos, cataloging the decay. Then she found the nursery. Tiny, rusted bed frames lined the walls, each one barely big enough for a child. A single rocking chair sat in the corner, its paint peeling, one leg cracked. As Emma moved to photograph it, she noticed something strange. The chair was rocking, slowly, back and forth. Her breath caught. She told herself it was just the wind, even though the air inside was still. She snapped a photo and moved on. The next room she entered was the dining hall. Long wooden tables stretched across the space, their surfaces scarred with years of neglect. Emma heard it before she saw it, a faint giggle like a child playing hide-and-seek. Her hands trembled as she raised her flashlight, sweeping the beam across the room. In the far corner, just out of reach of the light, a small figure stood. "Hello?" Emma called, her voice shaking. The figure didn't move. She stepped closer, and the light revealed a child. A girl, no older than 6, with tangled hair and a tattered dress. "What are you doing here?" Emma asked, her voice soft. The girl didn't answer. She raised a hand, pointing toward the far door. Emma turned to look, but the door was closed. When she turned back, the girl was gone. Emma's instincts told her to leave, but curiosity pushed her forward. She opened the door the girl had pointed to and found a staircase spiraling downward. The air grew colder as she descended, her flashlight flickering. The basement was worse than she imagined. The walls were lined with crude carvings, symbols and faces scratched into the stone. In the center of the room stood a large metal cage, its bars bent and rusted. And then she heard it again. Laughter, this time louder, echoing off the walls. "Who's there?" Emma demanded, her voice breaking. The laughter stopped. A voice whispered behind her, "You shouldn't be here." Emma spun around, but there was no one there. She backed away, her flashlight beam darting around the room. That's when she saw them, shadows, dozens of them, moving independently of the light. They crept along the walls, their shapes wrong, too tall, too thin, too twisted. Emma stumbled, her camera clattering to the ground. The shadows closed in and the whispering started again, overlapping voices speaking in a language she didn't understand. She grabbed her camera and bolted for the stairs, her pulse hammering in her ears. The door to the basement slammed shut behind her as she reached the top. Emma didn't stop running until she was outside, gasping for breath. She fumbled with her keys, jumped into her car, and sped away. But even as she left the orphanage behind, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Back at her apartment, Emma reviewed the photos. Most were what she expected, images of decayed rooms and broken furniture. But then she saw the nursery photo. The rocking chair was empty when she took the shot, but now a faint figure sat in it, a child, her face pale and her eyes dark pits. Emma's stomach turned as she scrolled through the images. In each photo, the same figure appeared, closer each time until the final image, taken just before she ran. The child stood inches behind her, smiling. Emma didn't sleep that night. The next morning, she decided to delete the photos. But when she opened her laptop, the files were gone. In their place was a single image, the nursery, empty, except for the rocking chair. It was rocking again, and at the bottom of the screen, a single message blinked. "You brought us back." The knocking started that night. At first it was faint, coming from the walls, but now it's louder, closer. And Emma knows the orphanage wasn't abandoned. It just needed someone to remember it.
Story number 2.
The Whispering Woods deep in the Appalachian Mountains, there was a stretch of forest the locals called the Whispering Woods. They said if you stood among the trees at dusk, you'd hear voices, faint murmurs carried by the wind, whispers that were too soft to understand but too distinct to ignore. No one ventured there after dark, but Eric didn't believe in ghost stories. A city kid spending the summer with his grandparents, he scoffed at the tales. When his cousin dared him to explore the woods one evening, he grabbed a flashlight and headed out, eager to prove there was nothing to fear. The forest was eerily quiet as Eric walked the narrow trail, the sun dipping below the horizon. The deeper he went, the darker it grew, the trees blocking out what little light remained. He told himself it was just a bunch of old trees and shadows, nothing to worry about. But then he heard it, a soft, unintelligible whisper. Eric froze, turning in a slow circle, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. "Hello?" he called, his voice shaky. The whisper stopped. Eric laughed nervously, shaking his head. "Just the wind," he muttered. He pressed on, but the whispers started again, louder this time. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, swirling around him. "Go back," a voice hissed, distinct among the murmurs. Eric's heart pounded. He swung the flashlight wildly, the beam bouncing off the twisted trunks of the trees. "Who's there?" he demanded. The whispers grew frantic, overlapping in a chaotic symphony of voices. And then they stopped. The silence was deafening. Eric turned to head back, suddenly eager to leave. That's when he saw it. A figure stood on the path ahead, barely illuminated by the flashlight. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. His body was thin and unnaturally elongated, his limbs too long for his torso. His head tilted at an unnatural angle, and his eyes glinted faintly in the dark. "Lost?" the man asked, his voice dry and cracked. Eric took a step back. I'm just leaving," he stammered. The man didn't move, but his grin widened, stretching impossibly across his face. "You shouldn't have come," the man said, his voice suddenly layered with dozens of others, echoing like the whispers. Eric bolted, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he ran. The trees seemed to close in, the path twisting and unfamiliar. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, and Eric swore he could feel hands brushing against him, clawing at his clothes. "Stay," the voices pleaded. "Stay with us." Eric tripped, falling hard onto the damp earth. When he looked up, the figure was standing over him, its face inches from his own. The grin was gone, replaced by a gaping maw that seemed to stretch endlessly. Eric screamed as the darkness swallowed him. The next morning, Eric's grandparents called the police when he didn't return. Search parties combed the woods, but they found no trace of him. No footprints, no flashlight, nothing. The only thing they discovered was a small clearing deep in the forest, where the ground was littered with strange carvings and dozens of human teeth. The locals whispered that the woods had claimed another victim. And on quiet evenings, if you stood among the trees, you could hear a new voice among the whispers, begging for help.
Story number 3.
The silent hotel hidden deep in the mountains, far from any major road, stood the Hollow Pines Hotel. Once a bustling retreat in the 1920s, it had been abandoned for decades after a string of disappearances. Locals avoided the area, calling it cursed. But to Brian, a self-proclaimed urban explorer and vlogger, The hotel was the perfect destination. Haunted or not, he told his small online audience, I'll prove there's nothing to fear. One crisp autumn morning, Brian packed his camera, flashlight, and drone and set off for the hotel. He didn't tell anyone exactly where he was going. The hotel was more imposing than Brian had imagined. Its once grand facade was cracked and weathered, ivy creeping over the stone walls. The windows were dark, many shattered, and the massive front doors hung slightly ajar. The air around the hotel was unnaturally still, the usual sounds of the forest muted. Brian set up his camera and began recording. "Welcome to the infamous Hollow Pines Hotel," he said, forcing a grin. "Let's see if the stories are true." He stepped inside. The lobby was a snapshot of decay. A grand chandelier hung precariously from the ceiling, its crystals caked with decades of dust. The reception desk was covered in cobwebs, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the air. Brian panned his camera across the room, narrating his observations. "That's weird," he muttered, pointing the lens at a guest book on the desk. The book looked untouched, its pages free of dust. Flipping it open, he found the last entry dated October 12, 1927. "Checked in, but won't ever leave," it read, the handwriting jagged and erratic. Brian chuckled nervously. Someone's idea of a joke. He continued exploring, moving to the dining hall. The room was eerie, with tables still set, as if waiting for guests who would never arrive. Plates and glasses sat undisturbed, and a grand piano stood in one corner, its keys exposed like teeth. Brian's footsteps echoed unnaturally, the sound distorted, as if the room were larger than it appeared. A sudden faint sound made him freeze, a single piano note, soft and resonant. He turned quickly, flashlight sweeping the room. The piano was untouched. "Wind," he said to himself, though there wasn't any. But the note had been deliberate. As he ventured deeper into the hotel, the unease grew. The long corridors seemed to stretch endlessly, the faded floral wallpaper peeling in strips. He came to room 217, its door slightly ajar. Pushing it open, Brian found an untouched room, as if the last guest had just stepped out. The bed was made, and a suitcase sat in the corner. On the nightstand was a photograph of a family, a man, a woman, and a young girl. Their faces were cheerful, but somehow unsettling. Brian picked up the photograph for a closer look. The little girl's eyes seemed to follow him. The temperature dropped sharply as he set the photograph down. His breath misted in the air. The door to the room slammed shut. Brian jumped, twisting the knob, but it wouldn't budge. He pulled harder, panic rising, until the door flew open with a deafening bang. The hallway was pitch black. His flashlight flickered, the beam revealing fleeting shadows that darted just out of view. Then came the whispers. They were faint at first, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from the walls themselves. But soon, they grew louder, forming words. "Why did you come?" Brian stumbled back, his heart hammering. I'm leaving," he said, his voice cracking. He turned and sprinted toward the lobby, the whispers chasing him, rising to a deafening cacophony. The chandeliers swung wildly and the walls seemed to close in. Reaching the front doors, he pushed against them with all his strength. They didn't move. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy silence. Then, from the darkness, a voice spoke clearly. "You checked in." Brian turned slowly. A figure stood in the center of the lobby, its form obscured by shadows. "And now, you'll never leave." The last thing Brian saw was the chandelier above, its fragile chain snapping. The camera was found weeks later lying outside the hotel gates. Its footage showed Brian entering the hotel, exploring, and narrating as usual. But in the final clip, as he turned to leave, a shadowy figure appeared behind him, its face twisting into a ghastly grin. The video ended abruptly. The Hollow Pines Hotel remains untouched, but now, locals report something new. If you stand near the gates at night, you can hear faint footsteps and a voice echoing from the darkened halls. "Welcome to the Hollow Pines."